Hi, everybody. So today we're going to take this step a step further, and we're going to talk about percents, fractions, and now we're going to add in decimals. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is place value. So I want you to think back to fifth grade, and even prior to that, when you talked about place value. Now notice we have our decimal point here, and then the first spot after it is tenths. If we have something that is two spots after, it's hundredths. And if we have something three steps after, it is thousands. So I want you to remember that as we're going forward. Okay. All right. So let's take a look. Let's review just by writing 87 hundredths. So I know hundredths has two spots after the decimal. Make that look like a decimal. So I would fill this in with 87. And I have a zero placeholder. Please do not forget that zero placeholder. It's going to be very helpful as we move forward. Okay. Let's try 5 hundredths. So now I know hundredths has two spots after the decimal. I know my 5 needs to go in one of those. But if I write something like this, that would be more like 50 hundredths. Because remember, we read it where it ends, right? So we know the 5 has to go here. And this is how I would write 5 hundredths. Okay. Let's see if we can do our next one. Our next one happens to be 8 tenths. So I know tenths has one spot after it. So my 8 comes here in this. Now, if I wanted to, I could write this as hundredths because remember, when we talk about percents, we're always taking it out of 100, okay, where I could write it like this. Okay. Now, I want to show you something real fast as we move forward. 87 hundredths, by the way, would be worth 87%. 5 hundredths would be worth 5%. And 8 tenths, or 80 hundredths, would be worth 80%. So I'm hoping you're getting the idea of how to move that decimal point as we make our percentages. Okay, let's try another one. All right, so here we have a picture of a hundredths block. Okay, so our first one is what fraction is colored yellow? So we can count by 10, 20, 30, 40, and then we have 5. So I know that that is 45 out of 100. Let's take a minute and let's write that as a decimal. So I know that hundredths has two spots after the decimal. We have 45 here and a 0. Okay. All right, let's try to see what percent is colored yellow. Well, 45 out of 100 or 0.45 is worth 45%. Okay. All right, let's try another one. What fraction is not colored yellow? So if we have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, then we have 55 out of 100. But let's write that as a decimal today. Okay, so I know hundredths has two spots after the decimal. I'm going to fill that in with 55 and a 0 placeholder. Okay, so what do you think that would be as a percent? So we know that writing it as a percent would be about 55%. Okay, all right, let's try another one. So this is a Google slide. And as we do this, we're going to talk about how we can change these to help us figure out if it's 5% or 50%. Okay. So one thing that we can do is I know that when I had something like this, when I had 46 hundredths, that was equal to 46%. So remember, we're going to talk about moving that decimal point. So to make it a percent, I'm going to move it twice, only twice this way. So you know that that's how it works, okay? Only twice. How many times do we move it? 2 times. So if I'm going to make my decimal into a percent, I'm going to take the decimal point and I'm going to move it twice. 1, 2. Because it has an empty loop, I'm going to fill that in with a 0. So 0.5 is equivalent to 50%. Now, when I have 5 out of 100, if I take this and I write this as a fraction, 5 out of 100, that means I'm looking at 5%. So the ratio of 5 to 100 is going to come over underneath the 5%. Okay, let's try 50 to 100. So knowing that if I write it as a fraction, 50, sorry about that, to 100, I know that when I write that as a percent, that means 50%. So let's write this in this column, 50 to 100. Okay, obviously 5% would come here, and I'm going to abbreviate that with the percent sign. 50% comes here. So I've done those two. 0.05. Now, I know that that's equivalent to 500ths, right? Because it comes 2 dots after the decimal. So I can rewrite this as a fraction, 5 out of 100. Or I can just move my decimal point. So I could move it twice. Remember, only twice. 1, 2. So this is equivalent to 5%. Okay, let's go to my next row. 5 out of 100, written as a fraction, happens to be 5%. 50 out of 100, I can write that as a fraction, 50 out of 100, which would be this, 50 out of 100. Okay, and again, we have the same fraction right next door, so let's just write it as a fraction, 50 out of 100. All right, and we have one last one, 5 out of 100, and I can write that as a fraction, 5 out of 100. So we're going to write those in words over here. Okay? All right, we have another slide to do, one more, and then we're going to let you go on your own. Okay, so for this one, I want to move my toolbar up here so you can see what we have. If it wants to move, sometimes it's stubborn. Okay, so here we go. We're going to write it as a percentage. They give us a percentage. We're going to write it as a fraction, a decimal, and finally a ratio. Okay, so 25%. Now we're good at doing this. We know it's 25 out of 100. I also know that, by the way, I can simplify that to 1/4. If we write it as a decimal, remember I'm going to move the decimal point over twice. Or I can also know 25 out of 100. I know that hundredths has 2 spots after the decimal. I'm going to write as 25 hundredths. And my ratio would be 25 to 100, or 1/4. Okay? All right. By the way, 1/4 cannot be written as 1.4. Just remember that. Okay, let's try our next one. 73%. I have 73 out of 100. That cannot be simplified. I know that hundredths has 2 spots after the decimal, so I'm going to write it as 73 hundredths with my 0 placeholder, and my ratio would be 73 to 100. Okay, so I would like for you to try 6%. Okay, so 6% would be equivalent to 3/50ths. But I also know it's 6 out of 100, so hundredths has 2 spots, and the 6 is going to go here. That's how it's written as a decimal, and as a ratio, 6 to 100. Okay, try 90%. You should have 90 out of 100. That could be equivalent to 9/10. If I'm going to write that as a decimal, hundredths has 2 spots afterwards. 90 hundredths is written like that with my 0 placeholder, and my ratio is 90 to 100, or 9 to 10. All right, let's try our last one. 44% would be 44 out of 100. If I simplify that, that would give me 11/25. I know that hundredths has 2 spots after the decimal, so I have 44 with a 0 placeholder, and my ratio would be 44 to 100. Okay, so good luck. Please take your time. Double check. If you have any questions, please feel free to come up and ask.